moving to the next book, it's called Acts, and Acts supposed to be the history of the disciples after Jesus Christ's resurrection. And no one knows who wrote this book. Many people think that the one who wrote Acts was Luke, because the first chapter of Acts is a continuation of the last chapter of Luke. So many people suspect, because there is some kind of similarity in the style of writing, that Luke was the one who wrote the chapter of Acts. Now, Luke was not one of the disciples, and I forgot to say that Matthew and John were the only people who saw Jesus Christ, according to the high criticism scholars, that they were actually the first witness to see Jesus Christ and write his biography. However, Luke and Mark, they did not see Jesus. Luke said about himself that he was a doctor, he was a physician, and so he was a writer because he knew how to write. However, Matthew and John, it is known to be illiterate, so how could they write books anyway, and very sophisticated books like that? And if we read also the four Gospels, we see that there are different ideologies and different doctrine in these four Gospels. So if you read Mark, for example, and Matthew, they talk about Jesus as he is the Jewish Jesus, and especially Matthew, it talks about Jesus as he is the king that is coming, and he's going to be ruling the world and things like that. But then at the end, nothing happened. He stayed as a very humble person. Also, the person who wrote the book of Matthew is very educated, because he could quote some of the verses from the Old Testament and put them in the Gospel of Matthew. And that tells us one thing, that the writer could be a person like a priest or something, or from the Abionites, people who actually were aware of the scriptures of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Now, the one who wrote Mark, he wrote Mark as he is a Jewish person who was very strictly with the Jews. Luke was a little bit more, you will see some of the ideologies of the Roman into the gospel. But if you read John, which was the last book that it was written, you will see many of the ideologies talking about al-hulul wal-ittihad, the unity of the soul and the unity with the universe. The Holy Ghost can come upon people, and many of these ideologies are influenced by the doctrine of the Romans, who believed in many gods, and they were polytheists, and who believed in semi-gods, and that humans can marry gods and they give birth to semi-gods or to demigods, for example. And so the Gospel of John is way off from the original ideologies of the Jewish ideologies. So Luke was the third book that it was written of these Gospels. It was elegantly written between 80 to 100 AD, and so they think that Acts was written by Luke, by the same person. But to tell you honestly, there is no historical account about this. And also Luke talks about himself in Acts as a third person, so there is no way that Luke could be the one who wrote this book. Same thing with the book of Hebrew. It is very sophisticated book. It talks about the systematic theology, try to match between and I talked about this in the Old Testament, where it tries to match between the verses in the Old Testament and the prophecies in the Old Testament, and how they were fulfilled in the New Testament when Jesus came. The book of Hebrew, some people, they say that Paul could write it because he was a priest and he was very knowledgeable in the Jewish scriptures, but Allahu A'lam, nobody really knows.